Hi, I'm Daniel Estrada. This is Engineering Ethics at NJIT. This is February 27th. We're in week 7, lesson 7. Let's jump into the course. This week I'm going to go over the NSP Code of Ethics for Engineers. I'm going to go over it in some detail. I know not every student is an engineer, and not all the engineers are going to be in the NSPE. You might have your own professional engineering societies that you become a member of. I'm going to go over the NSPE as a model for these codes of ethics. You can look at the code of ethics for your own field at the back of the book. There's an appendix that has the code of ethics for chemical engineers and civil engineers, mechanical engineers, software engineers. So you might want to take a look this week at the code of ethics in your own discipline, in your own domain. But we're going to look in lecture today at the code of ethics from the NSPE. Your assignment this week is also going to be a little bit different from previous weeks. Normally you can sort of write on whatever topic you want, but this week you have a specific writing assignment. I'm going to ask you to go into the Board of Ethical Review for the NSPE, to go into their history of cases. So here's the Board of Ethical Review. They have a backlog of cases going back to the 1950s, all the way up to 2015, where they consider about a dozen cases every year. You can look at any of these cases, go back as long as you want. I would recommend not going back any further than 1978, because the laws changed in 1978 that makes the cases after them a little bit different from ones comes before it. But go ahead and pick any of the cases from 1978 on. If you go into one of these cases, there will be a description of some case. It's an anonymous and it's a hypothetical case. It might be based on a real-world case, but these are all hypothetical cases. So it gives you the facts of the case pretty quickly, and then it asks some ethical question, and then the document here is about 4 or 5 pages, and it goes over the code of ethics that are relevant to this case. It talks about prior cases that the Board of Ethical Review has looked at, some previous cases, and then it gives a decision about the case under consideration. So the NSP has a Board of Ethical Review that has been doing these kinds of case studies for decades now, since the 1950s, to try to interpret some of the more difficult to understand parts of the Code of Ethics. So today I'm going to go over the Code of Ethics, and then your assignment for this week is to go find some case from the Board of Ethical Review and give an analysis of the case. It's important that you actually link to the actual case and tell me what number it is. So the number, it's going to be a year and then the number of the case for that year. So give the number, give a link, an actual link to the case, actually link it with a hyperlink so I can click on it and see the original case. I do this to make sure that you're not plagiarizing, and so others can look at and examine your work. If you don't put the link to the Board of Ethical Review to the PDF where it actually has the case study, one of these cases, so that's worth 5 points of your assignment, and so I will take 5 points off if you don't have a link. Because it's more inconvenient. Okay, and then your assignment is to give the case an analysis. So describe the case in your own words. And here I'm going to be making sure that you're not just copying and pasting from the PDF, but you're actually describing it in your own words. Discuss the ethical issues at stake. You might want to give an interpretation of the issues from the perspective of some of the ethical theories we've talked about in class. This is the kind of thing that will get you an A. More than just a sort of default grade, right? The minimum requirement is to give some analysis of the case from one of these Board of Ethical Review cases. If you want to go above and beyond that, give some analysis in terms of the theories that we've talked about. Discuss the particular codes from the Code of Ethics. Give those an interpretation also. Do these policies make sense? Are they fair? Are they clear? Do you know how to interpret them in the particular case that we're discussing? The goal here is not for you to just repeat whatever the Board of Ethics says. I want you to actually evaluate on your own. Do you think the ruling was fair? Do you think they made the wrong decision? Do you think the rules that they're making these decisions by are fair or not? Right. So give your own analysis of the case. The deeper the analysis you give, the better your essay will be. Try to pick a case. So there's lots of cases around, but try to pick a case that's relevant to your own career path, something that you expect you might encounter in your own career, maybe 15 years from now, whatever. Right. So don't just let this be an exercise where you have to do the assignments, try to actually think about the ethics in your own career, on your own career path, and how this might apply. I'm about to jump into the lecture right now. Let me also just at the top here introduce the extra credit opportunities that I have. So at the very top of the course, if you scroll up to the top of Moodle, now there should be open some extra credit essays here in section 58. Some students have already done some extra credit essays. So if you go up to the extra credit essays, there's a new forum up here. The forum has two threads. One of the threads has the ethics of your field, and the other is everything's remixed. The everything is remixed is going to be due at the end of the semester. In the next couple of weeks, though, if you want to do the ethics of your field, this will be due on March 10th. And what I'm asking you to do, so this week we're going to do the NSP Code of Ethics, but if you have some other domain where there's an existing Code of Ethics, tell me about the ethics of your field. Tell me about how the ethics of your field differs from the engineering ethics that we've been talking about more generally in class. If you're planning on going into the medical field and you want to talk about biomedical ethics, or if you're more on the business side of things and you want to talk about business ethics, especially like the ethics of contracts or this kind of stuff, please let me know. So the extra credit assignment here is for you to do some research, and I'm gonna expect that you do some background research. Find the code of ethics for your field, or find some important cases involved in your field, and then talk not just about the cases. Don't just tell me about the cases, but explain to me what it says about the unique ethical challenges of your field. Right. So if you're going into biomedical ethics, right, where are the specific ethical challenges in the medical field? Right, how does that relate to your career? How does that relate to the engineering issues that we've talked about in this class? If you're an architect, right, what are the particular ethical challenges of architecture, architecture design, that make them different from engineering in general? So this extra credit assignment is a little bit open-ended, and I'm expecting you to do some background research by March 10th. I will accept extra credit after that due date, and you'll get a sort of reduced grade. So I'm giving students a little bit extra credit if they do it before the due date, and a little bit less credit if they do it after the date. This is completely extra credit, though. This is not mandatory. If you don't do this, you will not be penalized. This is just to help your grade, especially if you're not as happy with the rest of the parts in your the rest of the grades you're getting on the other assignments. All right, so that's the housekeeping stuff. Let me go ahead and jump into the Prezi. So the Prezi this week is a little bit boring. I'm sorry. We're basically just going to be going over the Code of Ethics for engineers. The Code of Ethics is divided into two rough sections: the rules of practice and then professional obligations. So we're going to go through this in a little bit of detail. Let me first give you the background. The first thing to say is that the Code of Ethics is not very long. It's just 2 pages. If you go into the PDF, it's 2 pages, 2 columns per page. So the writing's a little bit small, but it's not that long. So the Code of Ethics is pretty short, and I want to go through it in some detail. I want to at least touch on every section here. Some things you should know just for background. The NSP is the NSP is the professional society for engineers, and most engineering disciplines have their own professional society, but this is sort of the generic U.S. National Professional Engineering Society. The NSP represents licensed engineers. Remember, states, we've talked about this a little bit, that states give out the engineering licenses. And so the NSP works with 52 states and territories and has some 500 local chapters where they work with professional licensed engineers and the communities that they work with. The NSP is partly involved in licensing requirements with the state. It's often that NSP members sit on the board, the licensing board that gives out the licenses. They also deal with ethical violations. They are consulted on for safety standards and other kinds of laws relating to engineering practice. The NSP is generally the professional society that represents engineers in the public domain, and especially working with government. The NSP was formed back in the 1930s. This is just a brief timeline of the history of the NSP. NSP was formed in the 1930s, and over a decade later, they first published the Code of Ethics. And it was originally published just as the canons, and then they were elaborated on several times. So this, in some sense, this is a living document. It changes. In fact, the last change we'll see later was back in 2007. There were major changes back in the 1970s. Some more recent changes back in 2007. Sort of minor. Hasn't been changed as far as I know since 2007. So this is about a decade old document. It was originally the document. The canons were originally published in 1940s, and then in 1950s they formed the Board of Ethical Review, which consists of 7 members of the NSPE. And the job of the Board of Ethical Review is to look over particular cases and evaluate them according to the Code of Ethics. So in other words, sometimes these Code of Ethics are a little bit ambiguous and difficult to interpret, and the Board of Ethics is supposed to give examples where they give an analysis of a case so that you understand what the board means by the various canons. Again, these cases are all hypothetical cases. They might be based on real cases that the Board of Ethics considers, but the cases themselves are hypothetical cases. Another thing to say is the NSPE doesn't have itself any legal authority. Usually NSPE members sit on licensing boards. If there's some ethical violation, they might consult an NSPE member, and the NSPE member might make their decision about the ethical violation or the legal violation on the basis of their interpretation of the Code of Ethics. Right, so there's an influence here of setting precedent. The NSPE has some authority here as the professional society, but they don't have the legal power to themselves grant or remove licenses or revoke licenses. It's the NSPE members who sit on the state licensing boards that have that authority. So there's influence here of this Code of Ethics on how licenses are understood, how ethical violations are enforced. The Board of Ethical Review has been around since the 1950s. In the 1960s, they adopted the Code of Ethics in something like the form that we have it today. And it's undergone some major revisions, some of them substantial. The biggest revision was in the 1970s. The U.S. sues the NSPE. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decision is 1978. The U.S. sues the NSPE over antitrust violations, and we'll talk about this later, but the original Code of Ethics restricted engineers from engaging in competitive bidding. It was formally looked at within the engineering professional societies that competitive bids worked against the profession. If you're competing with other engineers, then this is against the unity of the profession, right? It goes against the interests of the profession. And so the NSPE formally restricted competitive bids. But the U.S. wanted to engage in competitive bidding in order to save taxpayer dollars, right? The idea was it's supposed to be the cheaper option for the government. And so by refusing to enter into competitive bidding, the U.S. thought that engineers were, in some sense, holding a trust where the engineers were able to decide the prices and the costs of various things and of contracts, and the U.S. didn't have any negotiating power. So the U.S. sues. The U.S. wins this lawsuit. It's a Supreme Court lawsuit, and so the NSPE has to change its policies to allow for competitive bidding, and that's part of the changes at the very end. There's this little section about revisions where they talk about the results of the Supreme Court decision, 1978. Okay, so we'll go over that in a little bit more detail. This is just a little bit of historical background on what the NSPE is and how it works. The really important thing for our purposes is the content of the NSPE, and we've looked at this a little bit. There's a preamble. I think I've read the preamble already, so I'm not going to read it again. But they're the fundamental canons, and I want to go ahead and read the canons one more time, because this, not only the canons, a canon here is sort of a fundamental principle, and canons, by the way, plural canons, is the secret word for the lecture today. So the fundamental canons are statements of the principles that frame the rest of this ethics document. And in particular, it frames the structure of this document, so the rest of the document is really just an elaboration on these various canons. So let me go ahead and read the canons again. That engineers, in their fulfillment of their professional duties, shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in their area of competence, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. Notice that there's a big emphasis here on Honesty and integrity. There's a couple of these canons that have to do with conducting yourself in a truthful manner, avoiding deceptive acts, conduct yourself honorably and lawfully. Right, so a big push for honesty and integrity in these canons. Just from the perspective of the theories that we talked about, notice that each of these canons are framed as duties that you shall do this and do that and do. Right? These are commands. These are how duties work. They're obligations, and the whole code of ethics is framed in terms of these obligations. So the primary framing here is a deontological framing. But notice that within this framing, you have obligations to, and the obligations that you have are to form virtues, right? So notice that the descriptions here of what you should be are lots of virtue terms, sort of character terms, right? Honor, responsibility, ethics, lawfully, reputation, usefulness, right? These have to do with your character, character of the profession. And these are sort of virtue ethics-y kinds of terms. Objective and truthful manner, health, safety, welfare of the public. Those are also virtues of the public, public's well-being. Is there any consequentialist reading here? Maybe let me pause for a second and think both of the canons and maybe even of the preamble, if there's any consequentialist reasoning. Remember, consequentialism is about the outcomes of actions, right? So not just that the actions are good in themselves or that you have some obligation to do it, that you shall do that, but the consequentialist reasoning is about that it has the good outcomes. So notice that number 6 of the fundamental canons, that engineers shall conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. So notice that this is described in terms of what it would do for the profession, right? The consequences that it would have for the profession. Also in the preamble, I didn't read this, but maybe you saw it. As members of the profession, engineers are expected to exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. And it says, engineering has a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people. Accordingly, the services provided by engineers require honesty, impartiality, fairness, and equity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right, so the idea here is that because engineering has such a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people, right, that's the consequence that it has. It has this big impact on the quality of life for all people. And because of those consequences, you have this obligation to honesty, impartiality, fairness, and so on. Right, so this is more consequentialist reasoning. So it's not just telling you, it's not just commanding you to do things, but it's commanding you to be the best of things because it's important for these consequences. Right, so all three of the ethical theories that we've talked about in this class sort of come out in the preamble and the fundamental canons. All right, so the rest of the code of ethics is just going through these ethical codes with some detail. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to point out some important issues as we go through. So the first one, engineers shall hold the paramount safety, health, and welfare of the public. Should hold paramount safety, health, and welfare of the public. This is in the rules of practice. And there's really two sections here. Like I said, there's the rules of practice on the one hand. The other big section are these professional obligations on the other that we'll get to. So in these rules of practice, it's important that engineers hold the safety, health, and welfare of the public as paramount. I think I mentioned this when we were talking about whistleblowing, but I just want to highlight it one more time. Engineers are asked by the Code of Ethics to notify their employer or client or other such authority as may be appropriate. And it even makes explicit that sometimes right, so in Part C here, engineers shall not reveal facts, data, or information without the prior consent of the client or employer, except as authorized or required by law or this code. Right, so it makes clear that sometimes you might have a contract with a client that the contract says you're not allowed to reveal some sensitive information, but maybe that information is a big safety or health hazard to the public. In which case, even though you have a contract with the client to not reveal this information, the Code of Ethics says that you still have an obligation, a duty, and sometimes a legal obligation, but at least an ethical obligation to the safety of the public, to the health and safety of the public, that you might have to make this information public despite your contract to the contrary. In other words, the Code of Ethics here is explicitly authorizing whistleblowing. recognizes that sometimes either the law or this ethical code might override other kinds of ethical obligations you have, like to your client, to a contract. We talked about this earlier. I just emphasize it one more time. Another thing here that might be worth mentioning is that engineers shall not permit their the use of their name or associate with business ventures with any person or firm that they believe is engaged in fraudulent or dishonest enterprise. In other words, it's not just that you have to do the right thing, but that you also have to make sure that you're associating with people who do the right thing. If you're associating with someone who is known to engage in fraudulent activity, is known to engage in dishonest business, then your association with that person, with that dishonest person, can also be an ethical violation. Or even if you didn't yourself do anything wrong, if you're in a business practice, a completely legal business practice, in association with someone who is engaged in other illegal activity, then that might implicate you for possibly a legal violation, but maybe an ethical violation. I should emphasize here before we go any further that I'm not a lawyer. I'm not qualified to tell you what is or is not illegal. If you're ever in a situation where you're not sure about the legality of your situation, consult a lawyer, talk to a lawyer. Often if you're a member of a professional society, that professional society can recommend for you a lawyer that can help you navigate these interests. So I'm not here giving you legal advice. I'm giving you maybe ethical analysis. And the Code of Ethics says quite clearly that you're responsible not just for your own behavior, but for the associations that you keep. So moving on, we're still in the rules of practice. More rules of practice. One of the things that it says is that engineers should only engage in areas within their area of competence. So if you're a mechanical engineer and someone's asking you to make a civil engineering decision, if that's not your area of competence, then you shouldn't make that decision, and that you have an ethical obligation to refuse to make that decision, to find someone who's more qualified to make that decision. In general, a lot of the Code of Ethics for engineers is about how engineers have privileged knowledge, privileged expertise that they might bring to a situation. And the Code of Ethics for engineers is about your obligations for and your responsibility for managing that information ethically, with honesty and integrity. I mentioned this earlier, that this is really the big thing that makes engineering ethics different from other kinds of business ethics and biomedical ethics. Biomedical ethics is mostly about patient consent, the doctor-patient relationship. Business ethics is mostly about contracts and about fair business practices. And the thing that makes engineering ethics different is that engineers have special knowledge, of expertise in an area that makes them, that gives them insight into problems that other people might not have, in particular that other members of the government or the members of the public might not have. For the most part, I mean, the biggest issue for engineers is with health and safety, is that sometimes engineers are the only people who have the training to be able to see what the potential risks are, what the potential damages are. And because engineers are the only people who have that technical insight, they have a special responsibility to use that insight appropriately. So with health and safety, it also has to do with just insight into the contracting process generally, and we'll see that come up again in the Code of Ethics. One big qualification here, sorry, so the general rule is that engineers should only work in their area of expertise, in their area of competence. But one big qualification here is that sometimes engineers oversee projects that are much larger than any one person can have the entire project in their head. Sometimes so maybe it's the licensed engineer who is overseeing a lot of other technicians and other licensed engineers, even for a really big project. In these kinds of situations, the Code of Ethics makes clear that you can sign off on other people's work as long as there is some technical expert who can look at the details, right? So if you're the overseeing engineer who's overseeing a very big project, you might you might not yourself know all the technical details of all the parts of that project, but you have an ethical responsibility to make sure that someone who's technically qualified is overseeing those details. And as long as you are assured that there's technical expertise at every level of that process, then you yourself can sign off on the whole project. When you sign off on the whole project, you also accept responsibility for the whole project. And so if anything goes wrong in one of those technical details, that's also your responsibility, even though you didn't look over those technical details because you signed off on the whole project, right? So managing this kind of responsibility, especially responsibility for overseeing the details, right, the technical segments that only the engineers are qualified to oversee. That's a big part of the engineering ethics. One thing I like to mention here, there's a lot of concern in the Code of Ethics for the well-being of the profession, not just that you as an engineer are protected and acting ethically, but that you're doing it in the best interest of the profession generally, that you're helping other engineers, and that you're speaking on behalf of engineers, that you're a representative of the engineering community. So in code number 3 here in the rules of practice, that engineers shall issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Right, this is one of the canons, but there's also sometimes engineers might be called on to speak to the public, maybe to talk to a reporter about, if there's if a bridge collapses, maybe the newspaper wants to talk to an engineer about what happened. It's important that engineers have the capacity to give some voice to their expertise. Right, the public doesn't know very much about the engineering of bridges, but you might know a lot about the engineering of bridges. And if the public wants to hear from your expertise, you have an ethical responsibility, perhaps, to express your technical opinions, as long as you're doing it in an objective and truthful manner, as long as you're telling the truth. And part of what that means is that if you're talking about some technical expertise where you have some conflict of interest, where you have some other interest, maybe you're working for the company, right? So if you're the engineer for the bridge, for the company that built the bridge, then you have maybe some biases in describing why that bridge failed. And that doesn't mean that you can't talk to the public, but it means you have to make these biases, these conflicts of interest, clear, right? As long as you say ahead of time who you're speaking on behalf of, right? Whose interests you're representing, right? If you're being paid for the speaking engagement, right? If you make these things known in advance, then you're in the ethical clear, right? So you can speak about issues in the public. You're encouraged to share your expertise with the public. But if you're speaking as a paid spokesman, that's all right. That's not ethically wrong in itself. But you just have to make clear that you're acting as a paid spokesman, that you're representing interests that you're paid to represent. And even when you do that, you still have the obligation to tell the truth. You can't lie about it just because you're being paid, especially when it represents some potential danger to the health, safety, welfare of the public. You have an obligation to tell the truth. If you can't tell the truth, if a company is asking you to say something to the public that you're not willing to say, or that you have an ethical problem with saying, you can remove yourself from that decision, or you can remove yourself from that project. You might even blow a whistle and call attention to the ethical violations involved. Right? You have other options apart from just doing what you're told. And part of what the Code of Ethics for Engineers is telling you is what those options are, and reinforcing that these are, in fact, your obligations. Your obligations are to the health and safety and welfare of the public, not to whoever's paying you. It's okay if someone pays you, but you have to make that clear to the public because they have a right to know. And you have an obligation as an expert to let them know. So I've talked a little bit about conflicts of interest, and the Code of Ethics spends a lot of time talking about conflicts of interest. So this is in explaining the fourth canon, that engineers shall act for each employer as a client or faithful agent and trustee. And that includes making all potential conflicts of interest known. So a conflict of interest is a set of circumstances that creates a risk of professional judgment or actions regarding a primary interest. Let me say that one more time. A conflict of interest is when you have circumstances that might impair your judgment. Right? As an expert, you might make one judgment, but you might have some influence, say someone's paying you, to make a different judgment. That's a potential conflict of interest, and it might impair your judgment, or it might influence you to make a judgment other than you would normally. If you know that bridge is unsafe, but someone's paying you $100,000 to say that that bridge is safe. That's a lot of money, and that might convince you to say the bridge is safe, even when you know better, even when your expertise tells you that it's wrong. And the way that you protect against this is by making these conflicts of interest clear, right? So if you tell someone, look, they paid me $100,000 to say this, well, that lets other people evaluate your claim. So let me read the definition one more time. A conflict of interest is a set of circumstances that create a risk that professional judgment or action regarding a primary interest will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. Right? So if you're commenting on a primary interest, but you have this other interest that might have impaired your judgment on the first, then you have a professional obligation at the very least to make this conflict of interest known, right? To disclose this conflict of interest to all the relevant parties so they can decide for themselves whether they want to trust you in this project. Right, so engineers have an obligation to not accept compensation, financial or otherwise, from one party for services on the same project, or for services pertaining to the same project, unless the circumstances are fully disclosed by all the interested parties. Right, so if I'm working on one project and a competitor finds out that I'm working on this project and pays me to do something in the project, maybe it compromises the quality of that project, maybe it compromises the business prospects for that project. If I'm being paid by some outside party, I have an obligation to the first party to let them know that I'm being influenced in this way. Maybe it's harmless, maybe there's no problem at all, but I have an obligation to at least let these conflicts of interest be known. This represents a special concern when the parties involve state representatives, right? So government, and we've seen this several times when we go to the Deepwater Horizon case next week. We'll see this even more, but it's very common for state officials to be corrupted by undue influence from the private sector. And because government officials are supposed to be working in the public interest, in the interest of the people, and not in private interest, then these conflicts of interest become corruption, become very problematic. One of the more famous cases of this was Nixon's VP. The textbook actually talks about this in some detail. Nixon's VP was Spiro Agnew. Here's Spiro Agnew. He was not himself an engineer, but he had a lot of engineering friends. He worked with the engineering community, and he secured a lot of no-bid contracts for his engineering buddies. In other words, government contracts, million-dollar contracts, really big contracts. And Spiro Agnew, who was vice president and he was governor before this, he was ensuring that his friends were getting these contracts, these government contracts, and his friends were giving kickbacks and so on. He was getting bribes. He accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes for these contracts. When this came out, right, this is true. You can go look it up. When this came out, he offered his resignation, sort of kicked out of office. He was also disbarred. He was a lawyer at the time, so he was disbarred from practicing law. He was called morally obtuse by the judge who disbarred him. This was before President Nixon himself resigned from office for a different scandal. The 1970s were quite a scandalous time. It was partly as a result of these no-bid contracts that the ethics changed for engineers and bidding became ethical. Partly, government wanted to have bidding on contracts to ensure that this kind of corruption didn't happen. And that's part of what led to the lawsuit against the NSP in the 1970s. So there's a general rule against having these conflicts of interest, or when you do have these conflicts of interest, to make them known to all the interested parties, and in particular from when these contracts involve government organizations or quasi-governmental bodies, regular government contractors, and so on. So yeah, let me just read this. Engineers in public service as members, advisors, or employees of government or quasi-governmental bodies or departments shall not participate in decisions with respect to services solicited or provided by them or their organizations in private or public engineering practice. In other words, if you're working for the government, you shouldn't use your position as a government employee to solicit other contracts, either in private or public, right? Because this is a conflict of interest. Or if you're already a government employee, then you shouldn't be using that to solicit other contracts. And then engineers shall not solicit or accept a contract from a government body on which a principal or officer of the organization serves as a board member or as a member, right? So if you're soliciting from or accepting offers from government contracts from government agencies where engineers in your firm are members of that agency, this is also a kind of conflict of interest that you have a professional obligation to avoid. Some of these rules are a little bit opaque, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so if you have any concerns, specific legal concerns, you should probably talk to a lawyer. You can ask me questions, but I'm just not a legal professional, so I can't give you legal advice. But I can give you ethical advice, and the important thing to understand for the ethics is that it's not just about doing the right thing, but it's also about providing the appearance that you're doing the right thing. If it appears that you did the wrong thing, even if you did everything right, even if you're entirely within the law and maybe otherwise within the ethical norms, even if you're within the law and within the ethical norms, you still might be violating the ethics if it appears that you're doing something wrong. The closest I have to an example like this from my own career experience was when I worked as a tutor as an undergrad. So I worked as a tutor as an undergrad. I went to a public school, University of California, Riverside. So it was a public school, so that made me a state employee. When I was working as a tutor for the university, that made me a state employee. State employees are not allowed to accept gifts, and this is the case for most states that have these kinds of ethical rules. I was going to school in California, and California definitely has ethical rules about accepting gifts as a state employee. You can accept things like coffee and donuts before a meeting, but you can't accept like a steak dinner. That's too much. You can accept maybe pens and pencils. Maybe a coffee mug is too much. The rules for this are a little bit ambiguous, and they differ from state to state. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so you should look at the particular laws for whatever state you're working in. Right now, as a New Jersey Institute of Technology employee, I'm a state employee for the state of New Jersey. And that means I have to take regular ethics courses, PowerPoint tests, where we go over the particular ethical concerns in the state. And I, as a teacher in New Jersey, am not allowed to accept gifts. So far, none of my students have offered me gifts in New Jersey, so it hasn't been an issue. But when I was an undergrad, I worked as a tutor at the University of California, and there was one student that I worked with for several years. He was a computer science major. I was a computer science major also. And so I helped him mostly in math and calculus and so on. But I also helped him in linear algebra, but then also in computer science. We worked on programming quite a bit for several years. He would not have passed a lot of his classes without my help. And when he eventually graduated from the university, he wanted to give me some measure of gratitude. We had worked for several years. He was in the tutoring office all the time, and because it was a university service, he wasn't paying for it. It was just part of his being a student. So he had never given me anything as a result of this except his thanks. So after several years, he was about to graduate. He wasn't going to be using me for any services after he graduates, of course. So he wanted to give a token of appreciation, and he had bought me, this is back in 2002 or something like that, it was 15 years ago, a long time ago, and he bought me a Best Buy gift card, a $100 Best Buy gift card, as a token of appreciation. And at the time, I hadn't really thought about ethics. I was still just an undergrad. I hadn't really thought about ethics. There was no ethical rules that I had to adhere to at the time that I remember. But it was against the rules to accept gifts, but I didn't realize that it was against the rules at the time, and I accepted that gift. And I probably shouldn't have. It was probably an ethical violation to take that money. And the reason is not because I was doing anything wrong. It wasn't like I was changing his grades. I had no influence over his future career at the university because he was already graduating. He was already finished, right? I'd already done all the influence that I was going to do. So taking the money wasn't an act of corruption itself. The problem with taking the money is really the way that it looked to other students. So if other students had seen me take that money, they might have gotten the idea that maybe that student got better service from the tutoring center because he was paying them more. Right? The tutoring center is supposed to be a free service, but look at that guy's giving $100 to the tutors, so maybe he's getting better service than other students. That wasn't what was happening, but it might have appeared that way to other students, and the appearance of an impropriety is itself an ethical violation. Right? So this is why it would have been wrong. It might have created the wrong kind of atmosphere in that learning environment. It's not because I didn't deserve the money, and it's not because the students had any malicious intention, right, trying to corrupt me in any way by giving me the money. It was an honest sort of gesture of gratitude. But because that gesture could have been misinterpreted by other people watching, it serves as an example of as an ethical violation. And this is made clear in the engineering ethics code also. So this is number 5 of the rules of conduct, that engineers shall avoid deceptive acts. And one of the ways they explain this is that engineers shall not offer, give, solicit, or receive, either directly or indirectly, any contribution to influence the reward of any contract by a public authority, or which may reasonably be construed by the public as having the effect or intent of influencing the awarding of a contract. They shall not offer any gift or other valuable consideration in order to secure work. They shall not pay a commission, percentage, or brokerage fee in order to secure work, except to a bona fide employer or bona fide established commercial or marketing agencies retained by them. Right, the point is that engineers should not be giving, especially to government employees, should not be giving gifts, should not be involved in the gift-giving process because it looks like it influences the awarding of contracts. Now, having said this, New Jersey, especially the government leadership of New Jersey, is not very good about doing this. Chris Christie is often seen at football games in Texas or whatever for receiving gifts that are clearly payoffs for other kinds of contracts that Christie is involved with. And this happens at all levels of government. This kind of corruption is ubiquitous. The code of ethics here is not saying that this stuff doesn't happen. It's saying that you have an obligation to not encourage it to happen, to discourage it from happening, and to act ethically. When these things are brought up on ethical violations, the code of ethics is what is appealed to in order to determine that these are ethical violations. And the code of ethics states that even the appearance of a conflict of interest, of a conflict of influence, might appear to be contrary to the ethical code. Okay, so that was the rules of practice. The other big section, section 3, are these professional obligations. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. I don't have a whole lot to say because a lot of this is going over the professional obligations that have already been highlighted and sort of putting a little bit more teeth on them. Engineers shall be guided in all their relations by the highest standards of honesty and integrity, and there's a lot of discussion of honesty and integrity in the professional obligations here. The big thing I want to say to summarize all this, and I encourage you to read, like I said, it's only 2 pages. I encourage you to read through the whole thing on your own. But one of the big things in this section is to remember that you're representing the engineering profession. You're not just representing yourself, you're also representing all other engineers. And if you make bad or unhonest or dishonest or if you take actions that lack integrity, this reflects badly not just on you, but it reflects badly on the entire engineering community, the entire profession. Right? People might be less willing to trust other engineers because of your own failures of integrity. So this is why engineers have an obligation to at all times serve the public interest, not just the interests of your clients, but the interests of the general public. Also do right by your clients. And as we've seen from the discussions in this class, sometimes these things come into conflict, right? The obligations you have to your employers versus the obligations you have to the public. Right? Sometimes these things are in conflict, and it's not always clear what the right response is. So part of what the ethical code here is designed to do is to give you some perspective on how to make these decisions, and to think about yourself not just as a person, not just a person who wants the money, but also as an engineer representing the entire profession of engineers. Yeah. Okay. So this is section 3 of professional obligations, part 3. Engineers shall avoid all conduct or practices that deceives the public, and is more dishonesty and integrity. Engineers shall not disclose without consent confidential information concerning the business affairs or technical processes of any present or former client or employer or public body on which they serve. In particular, engineers shall not, without the consent of all parties, promote or arrange for new employment or practice in connection with specific projects for which the engineer has gained particular and specialized knowledge. I'm summarizing this here with the claim that with great knowledge comes great responsibility. Not just with great power, but with great knowledge. So if you're on some engineering project, and being on this project gives you insight into, say, some future business deal, or some competitor engineering process, you have some obligation as a faithful trustee of your client to not reveal this information and to not use it for your own advantage. In fact, we're going to go over a case in just a few minutes where an engineer does exactly this. I mean, again, the problem here is that it represents a conflict of interest. You're given access to this information partly in the assumption that you will be a faithful client and trustee, or you'll be able to keep this information secret. So when you use this information to your own advantage, or this represents a conflict of interest, it looks badly on you as an ethical actor, right? It looks badly on your integrity as an ethical actor. But it also damages the profession generally. A lot of things about the respect for other engineers, and a lot of this has to do with bidding against engineers or trying to harm the reputation of other engineers. Sometimes harming the reputation of other engineers might be a way of securing a contract, and this is a bad thing. Right? The Code of Ethics for Engineers discourages you from using slander or other kinds of attacks on other engineers. Because it looks badly on the profession. The Code of Ethics also cautions you against using your associations with non-engineers or with corporations or with other partnerships as a cloak for your unethical acts. This is sort of a way of gesturing as a Nuremberg defense. You can't use the fact that your client paid you to do something as cover for doing something unethical. If your client is asking you to do something unethical, then you have an obligation to tell them, no, I can't do that, that's unethical. And them paying you a lot of money to do it doesn't excuse the ethical violation. Yeah, so the last thing, I already mentioned this a little bit, but the last thing I want to mention about the Code of Ethics for Engineers is that it changes, and it's changed most recently in July of 2007, where there's this update about the 1978 Supreme Court case. So in 1978, the NSP was sued by the United States under the Sherman Act, which is an antitrust law, because the NSPE restricted competitive bids, and the U.S. government wanted to use competitive bidding to hire engineers to make these engineering contracts. So the U.S. sued, the U.S. won this lawsuit, and so now the Code of Ethics does not prohibit competitive bidding. It used to prohibit competitive bidding, it doesn't anymore. That doesn't mean that you're required to engage in competitive bidding. This is mostly for government contracts. Clients are not required to seek competitive bidding for engineering services, and engineering firms might individually refuse to bid for engineering services. The point of the lawsuit is just that it's not against the Code of Ethics to bid on these competitive practices, these competitive contracts. So that's the Code of Ethics. There's a lot of information there. Like I said, I strongly encourage you to read this Code of Ethics, to even read your own discipline's specific Code of Ethics, compare it to the general Code of Ethics here. I want to now look at, here's the actual PDF. What I want to do now is look at a couple of Board of Ethical Reviews, just so you have an idea of how these things work. So make sure to put a link to the Code of Ethics for Engineers, to the case file itself, the PDF. So this is case 90-4. 90-4 was done in 1990. This is the fourth case of 1990. Let me go ahead and read to you the facts of the case, and then we'll look at the rest of the document here. So the facts of the case: Engineer X is employed with firm Y, a medium-sized engineering consulting firm, controlled by Engineer Z. Engineer X is one of the few engineers in firm Y with expertise in hydrology, but the firm's work in the field of hydrology does not constitute a significant percentage of the firm's work. Engineer X, an associate with the firm, gives 2 weeks' notice of her intention to move to another firm. Thereafter, Engineer Z, a principal in firm Y, continues to distribute a brochure identifying Engineer X as an employee of the firm and lists Engineer X on the firm's resume. So the point here is that Engineer X is an employee with firm Y, but gives 2 weeks' notice and is about to move to another firm. But during this 2 weeks' notice time, Engineer Z continues to distribute brochures for the firm, identifying Engineer X as one of the employees of the firm. So the question is this ethical? Is it okay to be distributing brochures that list Engineer X as an employee of firm Y when Engineer X is about to leave to another firm? Is that ethical? Okay, so this is the case. They reference the particular ethical codes that are in question here, the section 2, 3, that engineers shall be objective and truthful in all their professional reports, statements, and testimony. They shall not falsify or permit misrepresentations of their associates' academic or professional qualifications. Right. So the Code of Ethics explicitly says that you have to represent yourself truthfully and honestly. Does this count as a violation of that rule? And then there's this large discussion, and the large discussion goes over previous cases. This case, a case from the 1980s, 1983. And in fact, it goes a lot into some detail about the 1983 case. And the 1983 case was problematic partly because one of the engineers intentionally was deciding to misrepresent themselves, right? Was intentionally distributing misleading information to make the firm look better than it was, to enhance the firm's qualifications, the appearance of the firm's qualifications. And this is the key point that the Board of Ethical Review says for determining whether there was a violation of the Act. To determine in particular whether they were relevant and highly significant, whether the facts being misrepresented were relevant and highly significant to the case. And so in this 1983 case, they determined that Engineer B, in fact, misrepresented pertinent facts where the intent and purpose of the engineer was to enhance the firm's qualification and work. In other words, they were intentionally lying in order to get more work. But in this case, in this 1990 case, the Board of Ethical Review says, in the present case, we are of the view that while the facts are similar, they're different in one important area. In the 1983 case, the engineer area was highlighting the firm's promotional brochure as a key employee. Under the totality of facts of the case, it was apparent that the engineer B's continued inclusion of Engineer A's name in the brochure constituted an overt misrepresentation of an important fact concerning the overall makeup of the firm. They say, however, under the facts of the instant case, there's no suggestion of any brochure or other promotional material describing Engineer X as a key employee of the firm, nor is there any attempt on the part of the firm Y to highlight the activities or achievements of Engineer X in the field of hydrology. In other words, the firm is not trying to misrepresent the role of Engineer X in the firm. And so it's not being used to enhance the firm's qualifications or work, right? Hydrology does not constitute a major part of the firm's business. So this does not look to be a manner, to be a case where there's malicious intent. In other words, they do not consider this to be contrary to the Code of Ethics. The Code of Ethics says that you need to represent yourself faithfully and honestly. And it's important, the board emphasizes that it's important that they do keep their promotional material as up to date as possible. But in this 2 weeks between when the engineer gives their 2 weeks notice and when they've actually left the firm, it's reasonable to have this out-of-date promotional material. The firm has some obligation to update the material as soon as possible and to make sure that potential clients know that it's incorrect in this one way. So maybe stapling an addendum to the brochures, an errata sheet that explains that it's a little bit out of date and then there's changes to the firm's makeup that you might need to know. That's the kind of thing that would keep them clearly within the lines of the ethical code. As it stands, because it's within this 2-week period where the other engineer is looking for alternate work, sort of a grace period. And so during this period, it's not unethical, the board rules. It's not unethical for engineer Z to continue to represent engineer X as an employee of the firm under the circumstances described. So, and here's the name of the engineers who were on the review board that gave this ruling. So I give this ruling to, first of all, state that not all of the cases are examples of unethical behavior. Sometimes the board rules that there is ethical behavior, even though you might think that there's some ambiguity. Well, here's a case where it's not unethical. Let me go ahead and look at one more case before we go. This will be just really quick. This is a conflict of interest case because this is very common. This is 14-9s in 2014, the 9th one that year. So here's the case. Engineer A works for GHI Engineering and is recruited by client to prepare an engineering study of client's parcel of land, parcel 1. During the course of the engagement, client requests that the engineering study be prepared in a specific manner because she intends to purchase the adjoining parcel 2, in approximately 5 years for a development that requires both parcels. So based on the information revealed to engineer A by the client, and without notifying the client, engineer A thereafter purchases parcel 2 for engineer A's commercial benefit. Was this unethical? So engineer A works for client's trying to develop parcel 1 and 2, and the client asks engineer A to do work on parcel 1 and tells the engineer that they're planning on buying parcel 2 in a few years. So to prepare parcel 1 in anticipation of buying parcel 2 a few years later. Then engineer A, without notifying the client, then buys up parcel 2. Right? The idea here is that engineer A knows that they can make money because the client is going to eventually buy parcel 2. So engineer A buys parcel 2 ahead of time in order to make that money. So the question is, was this unethical? The Code of Ethics talks about avoiding deceptive acts, always acting as a faithful client or trustee. We talked about this explicitly. Engineer shall not, without the consent of all interested parties, promote or arrange for new employment or practice in connection with a specific project for which the engineer has gained particular or specialized knowledge. Right? The ethical problem here is that engineer A was given special knowledge by the client in the course of doing the job on parcel 1, and the engineer used that information against the client in order to make money off the client by buying parcel 2. Right? This is a violation of the client's trust. And the review here, they go over a couple of previous cases, some 1990s, that are also conflict of interest cases. But for the present case, the board believes that the reasoning articulated, believes that based on these previous cases, it would be unethical for engineer A to purchase parcel 2 for engineer A's own commercial benefit under any circumstances. Under the facts, engineer A has received confidential business information within the context of a professional relationship and has sought to exploit that information for personal gain at the expense of engineer A's client's interests outside of engineer A's professional practice. Right, so engineer A is not acting on behalf of the client as their engineer. Engineer A is acting on their own interests in order to make money off the client by exploiting private information that they were given in the course of working for that client. Right, so this is using private information against the client. This isn't a case of whistleblowing, right? This isn't a case where there's some ethical violation that's being made public in order to prevent that harm from occurring. This is engineer A only using this private information for their own benefit. And this is a clear violation of the ethics. This is a violation of the ethical code. The engineer A, after doing something like this, could get brought up on an ethical violation, might even lose their engineering license if this gets brought up before the Board of Ethical Review. All right, I hope those case studies helps understand a little bit about what's going on. This is probably the driest and most boring of all the lessons this session. Um, since I'm wrapping up, I really shouldn't do this, but I'll go ahead and come back in here to the Code of Ethics and remind you that the secret word for the lecture this week is canons, the fundamental canons. So your assignment this week is to go find another case. Do not use the two cases that I just looked at, 14-9, 14-9 or 90-4. Both of those are off limits. Don't do those cases. I will mark you down for doing those cases. Pick some other case from the Board of Ethical Review. There's dozens and dozens of cases up there. And give it a good ethical analysis. I'm excited to see what you turn up, and I will talk to you on Tuesday. All right, thank you very much, everyone. See you on Tuesday.